Hey there again, Golden Bears. How are we today? We're now in Module 5.5, Victory for the North. And as usual, I'm going to start off with the story, and this goes back to connect with you in high school. I had a trigonometry teacher, and it was kind of cool. I was able to be in there with a few of my buddies, and this trig teacher used cards, let's just say, as a way to teach us some random things. And so Vic was the coolest guy. I, in fact, remember going in there, a few of us at lunch, and he schooled us up on some gaming that can be found at different 21 and over establishments that were very influential on us as being, 16 and 17-year-old juniors and seniors. And one such game that he taught us was this game called Baccarat. And Baccarat, I'm not sure the origins, if it comes from Asia, if it comes from the Europe, but essentially it is a card game, and if you follow his techniques and strategies, you often, he said, had the best percentage of winning over the house. And so here we were, 16 and 17-year-olds, and we found ourselves making road trips out to the river, and out at the river there were some adult establishments there in Laughlin that we kind of snuck into, if you will. And the audacity of it is that usually if you're 16 and 17, most students will go to the machines. Not us. We went right to the poker tables, but Baccarat was our go-to spot. And I don't know what it was. I remember we used to try and do little things to make our peach fudge stand out a little stronger by using eyeliner and different things like that. Just stupid things that you do at high school back in the day when things were different, a little bit more innocent. Didn't get as much trouble for things. And I can remember we did this probably 2 times over a couple different months. And so here we were, I think our 3rd time there. And what our parents were thinking, why we went, who knows what our parents thought why we went. They just figured, well, they're going to get in trouble on the road either way. So here we were at this spot, at this Baccarat table, well underage. And we never once were questioned why we were there, every time we went. And they got to be old enough. They must be young college kids out here doing this. And so here we were, enjoying the adult entertainment of, casino life, etc. And all of a sudden, we see our teacher coming down this escalator towards the tables of where we were seated. And there were 3 or 4 of us were like, oh, snap, dude, we are so busted. And up comes the teacher, and he sits there and says, boys, let me teach you a lesson. The thing that you need to know is what happens here stays here. We cool? We're like, yeah, we're cool. And then we proceeded to hang out with our teacher and do some of these activities there. Why was this significant? Because he taught us a system. And the system required us to follow exactly these various steps. And at one point, by the time you get to this certain strategy, you have to be willing to say, I'm going all in. And all in at our age, it was like 30 to 40 bucks. But dude, that was a lot of money then. That would be equivalent of maybe about 150 bucks of today's term. And we had to go and go all in. And it was crazy, but his methodology was kind of a win for us. And so I share that with you because there's a point in this Civil War where Europe is lingering on the edges. France and England are wondering, is the South and the Cotton King going to be victorious, or is the North and their industrial power and might that we need for various goods and services available as well? And it is here that we're going to discuss a battle where eventually the Europeans finally say, okay, we're going to stick to a certain side at this point. Abraham Lincoln, in the early midpoint of the Civil War, recognized that his paramount object in the struggle is to save the Union. It is not either to save or to destroy slavery. You need to be aware of that Lincoln, when he first is running for office this few times, he was all about kind of keeping the distinctions there, keeping the North in its place, South in its place. But as the war and the Civil War unfolded and evolved, he shifted it from being a Union-only battle to where it does become one of emancipation. Here are some things that you'll need to be aware of as to what were some challenges of the North and those of the South as they begin to unpack and face their different battles there. And as you go through my lecture today, it'd be helpful if you probably you either had a little matrix that you designed yourself to keep track of those types of challenges. Well, towards the end of this Civil War, remember, this class doesn't spend a lot of time talking about the key strategies and the key results and who fought whom and what, where, and when between the 4 years of battle. There are only like 2 or 3 key things that you need to be mindful of. And so it's my job, since that's what we're trying to teach you to us towards the test, to not overwhelm you with the possibilities of all those things. So you need to know that early on in the war, it's the Battle of Bull Run. It's kind of a funny story. Here they are just outside of Washington, and you have the 2 generals, McClellan and Lee, and they're kind of going to begin engaging in this battle. The Union thought it'd be something they can do rather quickly. The Lee thought they had the advantage. They show up. McClellan loses his strategy. He almost, the Lee does a brilliant strategy of peeling soldiers off and going up north towards Washington, D.C. This creates a little chaos, and what results is this first battle of Bull Run. The South take it, and ironically, there were people there up on the hillside watching this with picnic baskets, thinking, "Oh, there's just gonna be a little skirmish for a little while." And there were the Southern soldiers, the Confederates, there eating all those lunches of the people who fled back to the North. So we need to recognize in the first 2 years or so, it is a complete control that the Confederate soldiers in the South have better capacity. They, in terms of strategy, they have a very trained, they're not trained, but they're certain capable soldiers that are used to riding horses, are used to hunting, are used to handling weapons, etc. And so a lot of things went to the Confederacy, okay? However, we have at the Battle of Gettysburg a shift. And at the Battle of Gettysburg, we begin seeing a draw. And please know, the Battle of Gettysburg is probably one of the most brutal wars where, thousands upon thousands on both sides lost their war over that engagement of about a week's time. After that, we then have the Battle of Gettysburg, which takes just a few days as well, where they surrender eventually there in the city of Vicksburg. It is this point that 2 things begin to happen. One, the Battle of Gettysburg begins triggering Lincoln to begin saying, well, maybe this isn't a battle of keeping the Union together, but it's more about emancipation. But the second thing that we need to know about the Battle of Gettysburg and in the town of Vicksburg is that since the Union came to a draw, the Western European regions began to take note that, wow, maybe we shouldn't get involved and maybe we shouldn't choose sides with this because we don't quite know which way will happen. And so I will talk about those questions more when we get to the Steger Select Group, but recognize that the Gettysburg and Vicksburg campaigns are 2 important campaigns that you need to be aware of. Well, so as I mentioned earlier, is that at the end of these 2 key battles, Lincoln finally delivers his famous Gettysburg Address, and it is there that we see numerous sides of the Republican Party and his soldiers beginning to show support towards Lincoln. And this is a huge thing because Great Britain and even France then opt to not join the Confederacy, but to kind of push their way towards the Union. And I'll come back to this Lincoln winning election in 1864 versus General McClellan, they both had bad blood because McClellan not once but twice had floundered some Union battles, and they called him Tardy McClellan because one time he spent more time training had he gone out and attacked outside of D.C. General Lee. They might have some argue that actually the Civil War could have been shortened by it could have been completed in like 2 to 3 months, not the 4+ years that it took. So McClellan wasn't well received by both by Lincoln or even some of those war buffs there of the North. Well, we need to also point out that there are some numerous ways in which the African American community contributes during this time, because there is a depletion both in the North and in the South because of the war the attrition is causing, both in loss of life but also not enough food, not enough munitions, not enough supplies getting to the various regions to do this. And so what is interesting is that African Americans begin enlisting in the Army, basically helping trigger this idea that why shouldn't emancipation happen? If we're willing to fight and die, why couldn't we do that? And so they begin making some arrangements there that if we're going to join the Army, maybe we could be granted our form of freedom in that situation. And so what you need to recognize is that although African American in fighting, they were often given the most menial jobs and were treated as lesser than. And I would encourage you, if you have time, to watch the movie Glory that came out in 1988 or 89 that highlights some of this treatment towards the African Americans that were there fighting not only for their freedom but keeping the Union in victory. There's this guy here, Samuel Shank, who wrote a letter talking about the depiction of those soldiers who experienced deep prejudice by the Northerners, by the Union, and you find that ironic that was taking place. But go ahead and click on that hyperlink at some point, and you'll have a chance to see what that letter was about. Well, as the war kind of comes to an end, and the Battle of Gettysburg represents the shift in the turning tide, you begin seeing two generals representing the Union side. General Grant, a smaller stature of a man, begins doing the strategy of a hard war where we're going to not only just attack military targets, but we're going to destroy everything that the civilians have. And then then Sherman does this other tactic through Georgia where he calls it the Great March to the Sea, General Sherman, and he destroys almost the entire 60-mile, think of it like a tornado path, 60 miles wide, starting at one point in the northern part of Georgia, and heads down and kind of does a big check mark in symbolic language of just destroying everything in its way, from entire houses, communities, plantations, schools, you name it, churches. It was destroyed. Only thing that was left, they call it Sherman Stacks, the chimneys that were remaining upright as a result of this. What was kind of an end result of is that there were quite a few enslaved people who saw what was taking place. But the irony of this is both Grant and Sherman says, no, we're not here to liberate you. In fact, there are instances where the Union troops, sadly, had raped women and had killed some African Americans they were there to liberate. But ultimately he says, no, you got to stay down here because we need to go finish this war. We're really not here to be part of your journey. So it's kind of an irony at that point as what was taking place. At the end of this, we need to recognize that the strategies of this war did create some challenges that I encourage you to study, that Stanton went to investigate this type of thing to basically determine if Sherman was doing things of a noble character or not. But this idea that the president and Sherman did this field order number 15, please investigate it, because it's kind of an interesting idea. And it basically is this notion that what if we were to give these liberated African Americans 40-some acres of land taken from prior plantation owners? How would this redistribution of land greatly impact the redevelopment and reconstruction of the South? So definitely take a look at that field order number 15. So here's Richmond, remember the capital city of the South, where General Davis had been there, alleged president during the Civil War time. It was left in ruins with nothing left as courtesy of that. Well, now let's not lose sight that at the same time that we were trying to keep Europe out of the war, we were also encouraging Native Americans to join in and choose sides. And so please recognize that there were not all tribes. There were 5 major tribes during this time that some were choosing to side the North, some chose to side with the South, and in fact the South did some unique things in actually paying off some of their debts and giving them some land and other things to encourage them to fight. What did the North do? Well, after they won, the Union won, they basically then turned all of their guns and weapons towards the Native Americans, saying, now we're expanding westward, and sorry about this, but we got what we wanted. And so please keep an eye on the Native Americans and what happens to them despite their journey to want to help either side. Both sides still end up turning upon the Native American community. Well, during this time, before the Civil War comes to an end, is that there will be a 13th Amendment that's passed. Then following the Civil War, we're going to have the 14th, and then a year or so after that, we'll have the 15th. Each of them having different purposes and cause behind them. And so in order to be about helping defeat the Confederacy, the 13th Amendment was passed, hoping that this would, with the prohibition of slavery, hoping would cause many of the slaves to begin taking heart and abandoning ship and leaving the area, etc. Now, I would encourage you to slow down and look up the 13th Amendment, Google it or whatever tool you want to use, and notice there's going to be a phrase in there, unless duly convicted. I find it very interesting that in that language, if you've been convicted, apparently you could still remain a slave. Think about the consequences of that and what that means in contemporary society at this time. Okay. Finally, we get April 9th, Lee surrenders to General Grant and Appomattox, and they're at the courthouse, and some argue in Appomattox, is this the end of the Civil War, or is this simply just the beginning? Meaning, what now do we do after these 4 years of a mess? What now do we do now to reestablish who's at fault? What now do we do to rebuild? Who's going to pay to rebuild? Okay, there's so many questions at the end of this. And so, yes, thousands upon thousands of people lost their life. In fact, there were more loss of life in a Civil War than we had World War I and World War II combined. This is a very interesting question. Was this the end or the beginning? Well, sadly, we have challenges, as you're well aware. Not too long after the end of the Civil War, we have Lincoln shot at the Ford's Theater, leading to tremendous uncertainty as to how will President Johnson deal with the most challenging situation any president before nor since has had to face on their eve of coming into president. So to conclude, here we have Lincoln shifting his strategy aimed at preserving the Union to one that promotes emancipation, and then we begin recognizing is how does the 13th Amendment and the liberation and the ending of slavery, how does that affect this new birth of freedom for those found in America? So with that, we will come back to another. Hello there, Golden Bears. Welcome to 5.6, and Reconstruction begins. This quote here from President Lincoln at his second inaugural is one that I think captures the exact sentiment that he was hoping for had he not been killed at the end of 5 days at the end of the Civil War coming to a close. It says, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in sight, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. I'm not sure if you see that, but it doesn't sound like retribution. It doesn't sound, I'm going to make you pay. I'm going to get you, sucker. It doesn't make you say, like, where's the checkbook that I expect you to give? Where does it say that I can never forgive you? This reeks of the word of amnesty. How can we forgive? How can we move forward? How can we move on? This was President Lincoln's platform. This is what he wanted at the conclusion of the Civil War, and this is perhaps the defining kind of knife in the soil, if you will, or that probably caused his life to be taken, because there were countless people who felt this position was the wrong position to take. So let's unfold and see how that takes place. There's a handout 5.6 that is very important for us to recognize, is that you have Lincoln's idea, okay? You then have Johnson, who follows him, who succeeds him as vice president, who also, if you need to recognize, came from poor, meager beginnings, whose parents abandoned him as an orphan, who went and worked as a cobbler at the age of 10, who taught himself to read and to write, who went on from there and began engaging in politics, finds himself in Congress, and then finds himself in leading some sort of small little skirmish battles. And then next thing you know, he is nominated as a running partner for President Lincoln from the South. Yet what is interesting about him is that he really had a disdain for those gentlemen plantation owners who thought they were much better than everybody else and kind of kings of their own domain. And so his whole life seemed to be spent railing against them. So it seemed as though Lincoln and Johnson had a very, very good, strong rapport and relationship. Lincoln being the North, Johnson being the South, and Johnson having the capacity to say, I know that I'm from the South. I know I even own slaves. But I do believe that there's some greater purpose and cause to this. So a very interesting dichotomy of Johnson, and we're going to find out how he unravels a little bit later on. So make sure that you keep track as to how they share some similarities. It's just that we're going to find as Johnson's tenure unfolds and the tough thing he has to do as president for this chaotic time of America is that he begins setting up his own tone and his own pace and how he thinks it should be accomplished. But then you have a third group of people called the Radical Republicans. That's where Congress is involved. So when you see Congress and Radical Republicans, they're one of the same. Well, I want to tell you a little, again, the story. My dad, when I turned 16, my dad gave me a car. Each of our brothers, my brother and my younger sister, we each got a little car from him. He knew that I liked, just anything with my liberty and cars type thing. And so he gave me the slowest and the heaviest possible car on the planet at that time. It was a 1974 Volvo station wagon. It had a 4-cylinder motor in it. But I think the car was considered a tank and the safest car on the planet at the time. What made it unique, it can go like 0 to 60, and I think it took us 32 seconds, to get anywhere on that thing. It was a great car, he argued, for me, because I couldn't barely, and then if you get going over 55 or 60, the motor, all that. But what it was really cool for was that car can hit the dirt roads better than any others. It could go anywhere and do all sorts of anything. So although the Volvo wasn't an all cross-country car, I certainly thought it had that potential. There was one day I was out with my buddy Steve. We were out of school after school, but we had to hurry back. So I think we left. Must have had a 6-period off. We went out to go get some lunch. We were coming back because we had baseball practice that afternoon, and we're hurrying back. And we were coming down this hill that we've done this hill. I used to ride my bike on this. I grew up in the area. I knew the exact apex of the slide, because I knew as we came off this hill, at the bottom of this hill, there was always some sand that you can hit at the right angle that would come down as the rains would hit, and that sand would be there for months and months and months. That we just hit that perfect glide. You slide, power drift, and then you go up the hill to Steve's house, pull into his house there, he get changed, and we'd be out. Well, this time, I hadn't been in there for a week or two. As I hit the hill just right, try to give the car a little bit of air coming down off that. Simpson, my buddy, he's all, hey, Sneaker, you know that there's some construction at the bottom. Oh yeah, we got this. Well, what I didn't recognize is that they had cut away half of the road end. And so as I hit the apex, I'm like, oh my goodness. And so we went off of the paved part, and it literally dropped down about a foot into they'd taken up the whole pavement, and there I am, went off the road, and then I hit the curbing on the other side, and we came to a dead stop, and I'm like, dude, what's up? And he looked at me and go, dude, that was crazy. We thought for sure we were going to flip the roll or whatever else. Thankfully, no damage to us, but as I went to start the car and put it in gear again, it would just go clunk, clunk, and wouldn't move. I'm like, dude, let's take a look. So we go outside. You can look in the back of the car. The entire rear differential and axle was snapped in half. I'm like, dude, I'm done. And so anyhow, I there's a few more things to that story, but it was kind of a sad situation having to go to my buddy's house, call my dad. He had to come look at what we had done. He saw how fast we were going. You can see the peel marks of drifting on the dirt and hitting that. He goes, well, I could see you were going a little too fast here. I'm like, yeah. He goes, well, here's the sad part. You're done from the car until you have enough money to go get it fixed. I'm like, are you serious? He goes, yeah, it's on you. You did this, it's on you. I go, what does that mean? He goes, well, if it takes you 3 months to save enough money to go pay, it takes 3 months. So sure enough, I had to walk to school for about almost a month and a half until I had mowed enough lawns and did a few other things in order to earn enough the money to go pay off, to get the car out of the shop, because he wouldn't take it to the shop until I had all the money together to get this fixed. So I share that with you as a story, is that this time period of Reconstruction is you have a choice to make. And what is Lincoln, what is Johnson, what is Congress going to do? Do you want to take that car and just totally scratch it and send it to the dump pile and start new as a nation? Do you want to try and rebuild it? Do you want to refabricate it in some way? So these are the choices that America had to make to determine what the Reconstruction would look like. Ultimately, we're going to find out that it was rather ineffective and didn't work as well as it should. The first point is that, of course, we have the African Americans post with the 13th Amendment being passed, soon to be the 14th and 15th Amendment being passed, that this idea of reconciliation was received with tremendous open arms. Okay, and they were gladly excited, receptive, dancing in the streets, where at the end of this, they were just celebrating. But you would love to think that the northern white people, definitely the southern white people, they really weren't too happy about this. So remember, the northern abolitionists were like, great, yeah, I see they should be emancipated, but maybe not come live near me. Don't be dancing and celebrating near me. And so because they felt humiliated, not all, but most, they began lashing out, striking out, hurting, maiming, killing, hanging, all those nasty things that we might associate with what happened in the 1950s and 60s of America history started back then. So what is interesting is the courageousness that many African Americans had to have, as on the eve of great news, they had to return back to their plantations or return back to their homesteads, if you will, and quietly celebrate, as some quietly snuck away, some quietly left to maybe go find where their children had been taken or sold off to, or their wives taken and sold off to. So a lot of them took many different avenues and approaches, and some regrettably even stayed there on the plantation because frankly they didn't have anywhere else to go and were felt more fearful to go out into the public eye than it was to stay there and at least work for their plantation owner, who they knew didn't want to necessarily hurt them if they stayed and were obedient per se to this. Well, there was this new group that the government had started called the Freedmen's Bureau, which was an incredible new approach to help and assist the African Americans both on economic and legal and getting land. And don't forget, the fourth thing is helping them find out where their lost loved ones had maybe been sold off to. And so here you have a Union soldier in the middle, okay? On the left-hand side, you see some white, relatively poor Southerners there, outraged as to how these African-American communities are getting rights beyond what they felt, especially free land for the taking. And there you have on the right-hand side the African-Americans saying, no, we demand to have what the Freedmen's Bureau is offering us, and why shouldn't we do this? So the message here is saying, if the Union soldiers don't stay, what's going to take place in the South without that sort of representative thing? So the first priority that the Freedmen's Bureau had was to not only provide for them the finances, provide for them the capacity to get their land, but secondly or third is to maybe reunite their families. And so there they began doing all sorts of creative things to reunite them and create this new opportunity for families to come together. They looked and searched papers all across the nation to find where, from marriage certificates to death notices, etc., to see how they can come back together again. Another way the Freedmen's Bureau worked is that they helped legalize their marriages, so that way they can begin maybe working legally or getting land legally and participating in society with a greater degree of openness. The key thing that the Freedmen's Bureau did is it really recognized the need to educate these slaves who were not given that capacity by their slave owners, obviously. And so, although the schools were segregated and that they were treating like, oh, my poor little African-American child or person, at least there were resources available to give them opportunities, not just for kids, but for the adults themselves that wanted to be part of this. Here is an example of a said schoolhouse that, although rustic, at least it gave the children and adults that wanted to go in a sense of hopefulness during this time. The one thing you need to recognize is that one avenue in which how freedom was embraced is that the opportunity to worship freely, the opportunity to study the Bible in a way that might not have been seen through the lens of the white Baptist lens or from the white Methodist lens, but begin making choices of how they can view and interpret Scripture. But the key thing that they had is that they saw the churches as a political institution, that they can come together, and even though they can't speak freely out in public for fear of the white people, rising up against them, they can celebrate in their church services, and it is there that they had the freedom of expression to speak out against the injustices, but also to maybe come together and begin organizing through the Freedmen's Bureau ways in which they can get stronger. Well, there were some plans that Lincoln and Johnson had put together for this Reconstruction plans, and in your reading you'll learn about the 10% and what the states have to do in order to eventually become participatory and forgiven of the crimes allegedly from the Civil War. And there were some others, like the radical Republicans, that they haven't gone far enough. And so this proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, please recognize that there are some, the tone of it is, we know this is a problem. We know what had started with South Carolina seceding first and then triggering an avalanche of states seceding this. We know there were thousands upon thousands of people of lives lost on this. But at what point is America going to come back together again as one unified nation? Well, the radical Republicans thought this was ridiculous. The 10% rule was not strong enough, and so they responded back with the Wade-Davis bill that required 50% of the eligible voters to say, you must swear an allegiance to the United States. And what does Lincoln do? He goes and he vetoes this type of thing because he thought it was going to be more of a divisiveness rather than a help. Please recognize that they're just at the beginning of this lecture that you saw, the charts that we talked about. This Venn diagram, it could be a very helpful way of how to keep these pieces together. Well, with Johnson recognizing he had a disdain for the Southern aristocracy, the owners of the plantations, and despite him being a slaveholder, he also didn't feel the need to punish the Confederacy's leader. And just like Lincoln, he was trying to make it to where we can come together and have more of a moderate compromise together. He didn't go agree completely with what the South or the North were doing. And so you have, after the death of Lincoln, Johnson trying to continue on with those plans. Who steps in? You have Sumner and Stevens. They did advocate for suffrage, and they did advocate for the plantation being redistributed, but it's like they want to do this to create a pain threshold for the slave system in the South, not as a way to bring them back together. I'm not here to say what was good or bad, but Johnson then goes on and adds a few more aspects to this that begins to kind of anger the South and keeps them from maybe joining in earlier. Basically, it has to deal with a financial fact that I encourage you to go back and talk about, or at least to examine in your reading. Ultimately, we come to this point where with Johnson's Reconstruction plan, he recognizes that if they agree to his terms and moderates begin to disagree on these other things, we will begin to see this challenge of the South maybe not ever joining in. And so with this, we begin seeing, sadly, no change. In fact, it's less than 7 years it takes from the Civil War coming to an end before Confederate leaders who were leading the war for the Confederate side to be re-elected back into office. And you have to ask yourself, how is this possible that just in 7 years' time, not only are their states allowed back in, not only are they not having to pay back all this damage and problems they've caused, not only are they not redistributing land, not only doing these things, they've reinstituted these things called black codes that make it very, very difficult for African American communities to actually get out to go and vote. What do? They sat at the poll at the stations outside, maybe the churches or the schools, with their guns or their knives, and they did menacing, threatening things. They visited their homes at night. It was just an ugly type of thing that will eventually lead to the KKK that I'll talk about here shortly. But what did this do? It prevented more African Americans from being part of the political process and enabled those elitists that Johnson didn't like to find themselves into Congress. Well, what is happened here is Congress tries to bar these admission of these Southern lawmakers, and Johnson just gets kind of all diffused and befuddled as to what does he want, and it comes to determine that Johnson, on one hand, sides for bringing the Union back together again, but he also is siding for those in the South and the lifestyle that they have down there. His racism is kind of revealed that as long as they don't, if they don't refuse to admit certain Southern representatives, his boys from Kentucky, you know what? He's not going to pass laws that will allow, that affect, those who can join in participatory politics. So what happens is he vetoes these civil rights acts. He vetoes the Freedmen's Bureau. And what does this do? It sets him up to eventually get, at some point, put forward to become impeached. And I'll talk about that in subsequent slides. But it was during this time when they begin seeing that Johnson's kind of true colors of a South materializing. He keeps vetoing these different aspects where the Congress is trying to give more empowerment to the African American with the 14th Amendment and then soon the 15th Amendment. And what does he do? He keeps vetoing those types of things. Please recognize during this time in New York and other major cities, you begin seeing some rioting take place between different communities over how the African Americans are maybe given advantages over those who are the poor and those who are the white, disenfranchised from their lands. Well, by the time we get to the 40th Congress, they now have determined this idea of Reconstruction and what it's going to look like. And so they are intentionally trying to force every state down south to support the civil rights of African Americans and give them the right to vote. And what do is they divide the South into military reconstruction, military areas. There's 5 of them. I put the little illustration of the Hunger Games in there. And what is the significance of this? Is that they use it, as the map you can see here, as to militarily determine, unless you start supporting what the federal government wants and the Congress has determined and demanded, apart from a president that is totally against it, we're going to stay there and make sure that you do this. I'm sure Lincoln was rolling over in his grave. He's like, this isn't the amnesty that I'd hoped for and longed for. Well, we begin seeing a different struggle for power take place. There in the presidency, you see Johnson doing some things that is kind of misconstrued or maybe challenged for his kind of racism that's happening and how he's vetoing different votes that are coming along. The Republicans press forward to articles of impeachment. What happens? He's one short vote of being convicted, and so he was never removed from presidency, but by then his colors were truly shown, and the inability to bring America back together under one unified body was not possible. Both the Lincoln Plan and the Johnson Plan of reconciliation had failed. Well, ironically, and I close to this here soon, is this idea for universal suffrage or voting. Remember, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott in 1848, they're trying to get at the Seneca Convention the right for women's vote. And so the women join in to help the African American abolition movement get steam and get energy and to get a platform. And here we have finding the 13th and 14th and now the 15th Amendment giving the rights for African American men the right to vote. Passed. That's great. Great opportunity and great start. But what does this do to the women? It infuriates them. They're like, what? How come African American men now have the right to vote, but I do not as a woman? And so this is some interesting things that take place that, again, in theory, it is there, but you're going to hopefully begin seeing in the next time that there's going to be women that are going to be pulling away their support from the African American movement because of this. And that's going to make things rather confusing when just 30 years before they're the biggest champions of African Americans gaining rights, etc. But we're also going to see that this is going to lead to some debates and confusion as we progress through this into the next final two discussions. So with that, I conclude the Reconstruction created new debates, new problems. Nobody followed Lincoln's plan. Johnson messed it up and created issues. We see the 14th, 15th Amendments there to give African Americans rights and civil rights. What was the response? They were short-term successes because the long-term reality is the black code laws were passed in the South, which we'll spend some more time talking about here in the next situation. All right, keep it classy, Golden Bears.